Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and anybody else on YouTube who is paying attention to my recitation of and criticism of the Umayyad period. I left you at the Jude leaders in the area and the subjugation to the effective control from Cordoba, and we will continue from there. Another ideological challenge came from the Aldid pretender in the Eastern Islamic world. The members of the House of Ali, first cousins to the Prophet and husbands of his daughter Fatima, were the most powerful force of opposition to both the Umayyads and the Abyssinian Caliphates. Most of their followers, however, came from Iraq and points east, and they had little support among the Syrians, who formed the majority of the Arab settlers in the Al-Andalus. Heterodox religious opinions were more widespread among the Bedouins, however, and in North Africa at the time. Their opinions usually took the form of Khajarism, but in 768 and 770, a Bedouin of the tribe of the Mirkris called Sakrat Abdul al-Washid led a revolt, claiming to be the relative to the Alids. His rebellion began in Santiveria in the hills around Corsuris, but for the next 9 years he dominated much of the sparsely inhabited upland country between Santiveria and Cora and Medellin, far to the west. It was a guerrilla war. The Babians retreated to the mountains on approach of the Amir's army and returned to the villages and plains when they had gone. The rebellion was an irritation, but the so distant Fatimids seemed to have attracted no support amongst the Arabs or the town dwellers, and the Abdul al-Rashmin was also able to make an alliance with the Hilat al-Meriz, described as herd Riasa of the Bedouins in the east of Al-Andalus. In the end of 776 and 77, Sashkas was taken by treachery and killed. Although he claimed command and support among the Bedouins, there is little evidence that this, or indeed any other of the Bedouin disturbances of the time, were motivated by Bedouin resentment against Arab control. Abdul al-Rashmin had Bedouin supporters and Bedouin opponents, just as he had Arab supporters and Arab opponents. The real distinction was between those who threw in their lot with Cordoba and those who were determined to maintain their own local independence. Local independence was massive in this time period. Basically, these individual Jews would be led by their elders, their political structures, their own individual makeups. And many of these Jews were corporate at this point. They were very mercantile as well. There was an area of localized resistance in the west and north of the peninsula. Not surprising, Abdul al-Rashid had difficulty imposing his authority on distant Zagros. The Arab notables of Zagreb and the Ebron Valley resisted Umayyad attempts to take the city, as they had resisted the attempts of previous emirs, and the tradition of local autonomy was well established. In about 774, Suleiman B. Yarakus al-Aris, lord of the Barcelona and Juria, and al-Hajiz B. Yusuf Sahid bin Umar, descendant of the famous Madinian companion of the Prophet in Zagros, were the main powers in the area. In order to maintain his independence status, Suleiman sent a mission to Charlemagne's court at Paderborn to ask his support, probably in return for the overlordship of Zagros. Charlemagne arrived in Ebron Valley in 778, but Al-Hassas refused to cooperate with the emperor, who, having no siege engines, had to withdraw, humiliated, from the walls of the city. It was during his return journey that the Basques attacked his rearguard in the Pyrenean Pass, and Rus was given rise to the legends which are recounted in the Songs of Roland. Through the first text of this great epic does not appear for 3 centuries after the events, and the history details has become widely confused. In the aftermath of this debacle, Suleiman was executed by his estuarine my apologies, I seem to have... Other attempts by the Ferris establishments of the peninsula first came... The debacle. Suleiman was executed by his Eshwit ally, Al-Hassun, but his sons inherited his position in Barcelona and Juria. It seems that the Emir Abdul al-Rashid was alarmed by these turn of events. In 781, he led a military expedition to demand the submission of Al-Hassun's Yahya and to re-establish Muslim control in the upper Ebron Valley. At first, Al-Hassun accepted the Emir's authority and was confined as governor of the city, but the next year he threw off the allegiance. Abdul al-Rashid returned and assaulted the city with siege engines. Majoriku, I think they're called, against the townspeople. The whole complex episode shows how the Umayyad Emir tried to establish his authority over the local magnates by a mixture of diplomacy and occasional force, but that as long as they were content to accept his overlordship, he was prepared to leave them in their peace. By the end of his reign, Murdia and Toledo were being governed by his sons Hisaman and Suleiman, but it is not clear that the Umayyads executed any direct control in the Ebros Valley. In one area they certainly did not. It was in 785, according to the Chronicles of Mosaic, that the inhabitants of Gurun threw off the authority of the sons of Suleiman Usurin and handed their city over to the Carolonians. The event produced no reaction in Cordoba, and it is not noted in the Arab chronicles. Not all of Abdul al-Rashid's energies were devoted to assuring his military control over Andalusia. His reign saw the confirmation of positions of Cordoba as the capital of Andalusia. The status of the city was confirmed when Abdul al-Rashid built a country palace at Al-Rusa to the northeast of the town. In addition to the Quasar in the centre of town, and in 785 the beginning of the construction of the mosque, which still survives with many later additions to the present day. So we're now reaching the reign of Hisaman I and Al-Hakam I, 788 to 822. Let us continue. Abdul al-Rashid bin Marwan died on the 7th of October 788. His achievements had been enormous, but he had put them all in jeopardy by his hesitation about the succession. Whilst it was clear he intended that the Emirate should remain hereditary within the Umayyad house, it was not certain which of his sons should succeed him. The principle of primogeniture, which became so important to the ruling houses of medieval Christendom, was never established in the Umayyad families. This kind of ran against Muslim mentality. This allowed Muslim men to discuss who was the most able, who was the most capacity. This is a very big reinforcement on why Abu Bakr became the leader of the Muslim world instead of Ali, and hence leading to our honourable disagreement between us and our brothers in the Shia community, because there is this principle in Muslim community where men will get together and discuss who is the most able to do the job. And hence where this is quite normal even for this time period. Never established in the Umayyad families, designated by the previous rulers and accepted by other members of the family and their supporters, were the determining factors in deciding who among its members should succeed. Abdul al-Rashid had three sons who emerged as possible candidates: Suleiman, who had been born in the east and was now in his early 40s, Hisaman, who had been born in Cordoba in 757, and Abdul Ali, who does not seem to have been a serious candidate at this stage, but was to become an important figure in years to come. Neither Suleiman nor Hisaman were at their father's deathbed, Suleiman being in Toledo, Hisaman in Merida. Some say that Hisaman was his father's final choice, other than the dying Emir told Abdul Ali to acknowledge whichever of the two reaches Cordoba first. Hisaman, he said, had the advantage of piety and a good education, Suleiman of age, bravery, and the devotion of the Syrians. It only took 6 days for Hisaman to come from Merida, and Abdul greeted him as ruler and handed over the seal of office. But his other brother was not prepared to accept this verdict and gathered his supporters to march south. There was a short, sharp conflict near Jan, and Suleiman's men were defeated. It took almost 2 months for Hisaman to reduce Toledo and oblige his brother to surrender. But in 789, Suleiman was paid 60,000 dinars in cash, possibly half the annual income of an emirate at this time, and was forced to leave to North Africa, promised not to return. Umayyads might be defeated and disgraced, but the diem they would not be executed like any common rebel, for that would be undermine the status of the whole ruling house. You see, the Umayyads started doing things differently, where in the early Islamic world, if you defeated your enemy in battle, God was against you, you would be killed. Or you would do something that led towards your death, like you wouldn't surrender even if you were losing the battle, so that you could die honourably. These things were quite normal. As far as we can tell, the new Emir faced little internal opposition upon the defeat of his brothers. He had directly dealings with the magnate of the Ebon Valley in 788 and 9, Sahabis Al-Hasun and Al-Ansar, whose father had held Zagros against the Umayyads in the previous reigns, took the city again, proclaiming himself Emir. He was soon defeated not by the Umayyad troops, but by Musa ben Forta bi Qasa, whose grandfather had been the count of the area in Visigoth times and one of the earliest and most distinguished converts to Islam. 791-2, Zagros was taken over by Mutra, the son of Suleiman bi Yusuf, and an expedition was sent from Cordoba to drive him out. The problem was solved, however, when Muta was murdered by one Amos bi Yusuf whilst he was out hunting, and the city was handed over to the Umayyad forces. The emir came from a Malwa, native Muslim background, and is first recorded as a Gulen military page in the service of Suleiman bi Yusuf and his family. He now seems to have decided to throw in his lot with the Umayyads against his old masters. He and his family were rewarded by their favour of the ruling dynasty, and during the next century they would become one of the most powerful families in the Upper March. The rise of the Banu Qasir and the Banu Amris at this time, allied with the Umayyads against the leading Arab families of the area, marks the beginning of the entry of the Mawlids into political life of Al-Andalus. The Arab chronicles give Hisamarius a pious and assertive personality and say that he sought to exert his authority rather by personal example and by leading the Muslims against the Christians of the north. His commitment to good works expressed itself in the completions of the first phase of the mosque in Cordoba, including the Abdul facilities and the minaret, and the repair of the bridges. Another manifestation of his piety was the sending of military expeditions against the Christians, among them a number of campaigns in the Asturias and Upper Ebron, and a major attack on Nebros and Casacrun in 793. When the Count of Toulouse and William Short Nose was killed, Hisan himself did not lead the campaign, but entrusted command to the two brothers Abdul al-Malik and Abdul al-Karim bi Abdul al-Wasid bi Margarat. These campaigns were important in asserting the role of the Umayyads as leaders of all the Muslims of the Al-Andalusians and of bringing Umayyad armies to parts of the country where they would not normally penetrate. In this, Hisan was established as a president which would be followed by many of his successors. You see, piety, building and politics need to run hand in hand when you are engaging in ancient Islamic politics. You needed to be pious, you needed to be righteous, you needed to be politically suited, and to be fair, you needed to be a military leader. Even if you were an imam, you needed to be a military leader. Leading militaries was a normal thing for the Islamic world at this time period, because if you couldn't wield a sword, you weren't considered righteous or pious in that time period. Abdul al-Qasim was Hisman's chief minister until his death, fairly early in the reign. The inner circle also included his secretary, Isam bin Shahid, whose father had served Abdul al-Rashid and whose family was to provide Cordoba with bureaucrats for the next 3 centuries, as well as one of the Al-Andalusia's greatest poets. Hisman's modest piety, attending at funerals and visitations of the sick, earned him such a reputation that the great Medinan scholar Malik bi Anas, who works so profoundly affected all Andalusia, is said to have wished that Hisan could make the pilgrimage in person, which of course he could not, Mecca and Medina being in the power of the Abyssinian caliphs of Baghdad. Certain rulers during this time period did not make Hajj because of the behaviour involving international fights. This is actually not as unusual as people think it is. It simply was unpractical. The Abyssinians would not have taken the ability to actually seize a king or kill a king or try to force some kind of governmental transfer of power or obligation during Hajj. So it was just too dangerous. The connections with Medina was to prove very important, as far as we can tell. Andalusians never visited Damascus or Baghdad at this time, although there was a good deal of immigration from the Eastern Islamic world, but they could and did go on pilgrimage to Medina and Mecca in cooperatively large numbers, especially those who aspired to be Fafria or Qasists. It was not surprising, therefore, that the knowledge of Muslim law that they picked up was the teachings of the preeminent Medinan masters. Malik bi Anas Malik died in 795, was the founder of the oldest of the 4 orthodox schools of Islamic law, the other 3 being the Hanabas, the Shafi'ah and the Hanifa. all developed in the 9th century. Malik's law, as exposed in the Kitab al-Murst of Malik himself and later works, notably by al-Malwin al-Quirin of Salim al-Qaras, was essentially the codified practice of Medina. As such, it was practical and much concerned with orderly everyday life, and especially with the facilities of trade and commerce. At the same time, the system left little room for abstract speculation and virtually none at all for innovation. The fact that it could be adopted as a fully working out system no doubt increases attractiveness for an isolated Muslim colony like the Al-Andalusicans. This is a key reason why I really do like what I've read bits and pieces of Malik's work, especially as an Orthodox Muslim scholar. And I personally can say that it was one of those things that you could adapt even to a modern time period. I'm sure that's going to offend some people. The codified practice of Medina, as such, it was practically much concerns with originally ordering everyday life, and especially with the facilities of trade and commerce. At the same time, the system left little room for abstract speculation, virtually none for all innovations. The fact that it could be adopted as a fully working out system no doubt increased its attractiveness to the isolated Muslim colony, like the Al-Andalusicans, whose members wanted practical solutions rather than opportunities for debate. It also gave great power and status to small, self-preparing groups of scholars who were familiar with the doctrine, notably in the first generation. Yahya Al-Andalus died 848, a pupil of Malik himself, who would be his advice effectively controlled the appointment and dismissal of Qayases of Cordoba. The adaptation of Malik's school so completely met the Al-Andalus was spared the sort of sectarian dissection which tore Baghdad society apart in the 3rd and 10th and early 4th, 11th centuries. Malikism was hostile alike to Qajarism, Shiism, and even to the more innocent forms of Sufism, and none of them really secured widespread support in Al-Andalusia. You see, at this point, conflicts intersecting was completely normal. I won't say it's not now, I'm just saying it's less of effect than what it was during the Al-Andalusian time period. On the debate side, however, Malikism offered a rather formal and rigorous version of Islam, more concerned with correct performance than inspiration, and it discouraged speculation and discussion. If Cordoba was spared the conflict that convulsed Baghdad, it also saw none of the intellectual excitement that accompanied them. Hissim died on 17th of April 796. He was careful to leave no uncertainties about the identity of his chosen successor, and his son Al-Hakim, now 26 years old, was dutifully accepted as Emir in Cordoba. The sources portray him as a very different character from his father, tall, thin, haughty, and strikingly dark in complexion. The new prince was to prove a formidable ruler. He was fond of women and wine, too much so, some said, and was no mean poet. But he was remembered more for his cunning, his implacable ruthlessness, and his awesome speed with which he reacted to news of dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction did not take long to become apparent. His father had been opposed by his two brothers, Suleiman and Al-Andalus. Both they were still alive, in exile in North Africa, and they were now determined to regain their lost inheritance. The turbulent Suleiman spent the next 4 years wandering the country, attempting to build up enough support, largely among the Bedouins of the south, to dislodge his nephew. He was defeated in a number of encounters and was finally surrounded to Al-Hakum by the Bedouin governor of Merida, Asbin bi Wuswas. He was executed in 800, the first member of the ruling family to suffer at this indignation. Remember, the Al-Andalusicans tried very, very hard to avoid executing their family members, but if you made so much trouble, eventually even they were have you off, because that's the reality of it. Though the Al-Andalusicans and the Umayyads themselves in this period tried to avoid killing family member, it wasn't unheard of. It was considered an ugly truth. You know, give your uncle a couple of tries, tell him to back the fuck off, get out of my country, I don't want you here, you're trouble, right, I've got you, now I'm going to kill you. And that's just how history rolls. In many ways, he tried very, very hard to avoid killing his uncle. And I will leave that as that episode. I will be making another one this afternoon, alhamdulillah, and it's been a pleasure having you.